case you haven't noticed, I'm a little busy here.
Good job, Choo-Choo.
What the hell? I killed you!
Yeah? Well, I'm back.
If at first you don't succeed.
Hand to up, watch your head. Swing right. Left. Left, no right. Left, left. Go right.
When a large group comes together to work on a project, the project will often end up sterilized or characterless. Quirky and strange ideas get watered down, and the final product feels homogeneous and average. Slovenian developer Zootfly managed to avoid these pitfalls in their 2013 release, Marlow Briggs and the Mask of Death. After a few military games and a couple of tie-in games, Zootfly teamed up with Microsoft Studios to produce something a whole lot wackier. Marlow Briggs isn't perfect, but it is overflowing with personality, and the experience is fantastic. I've often heard the phrases character action or spectacle fighter used to describe these stylish 3D hack and slash action games. Early titles like Gauntlet and Rastan are visibly quite different to Bayonetta, but the main gameplay plan is still rather similar despite the differences in presentation. The player will still have to battle through large swarms of enemies with slashy wide attacks. Later releases encourage players to attempt to combine many attacks together to earn high scores or for visual flair. This, combined with a gargantuan gameplay scenario, are the main reasons I prefer Spectacle Fighter as the describing style. Marlow Briggs seems to agree that spectacle is the goal to pursue. Environments are massive and arranged in unapologetically ridiculous ways to offer Marlow a platforming challenge and the player an impressive visual as they proceed. The narrative is schlocky and silly, but the game never takes the events seriously, and both Marlow and the Mask will often crack jokes. Marlow wields an ancient scythe weapon that can be changed into 3 other forms throughout the game. Each of the weapons has its own unique moveset with combos as well as advantages and disadvantages for using in any particular battle. The animations are excellent and crank the cool factor up a few notches. They also... Wait, I've seen that before somewhere. So the similarities to God of War are undeniable. Zootfly's inspiration is blindingly clear. Some might say it is encroaching on plagiarism. I personally don't think this is a negative on the game. Sony's God of War series features platforming sections, light puzzles, and multi-phase giant bosses, which Marlow Briggs also contains. This knife chain weapon is also quite distinctly a God of War weapon, and it has been changed largely enough for the details to be different, but from the outside it definitely looks suspicious. However, God of War is a PlayStation exclusive series, and there doesn't appear to be any change coming in that respect. Microsoft Studios assisted Zootfly in development of Marlow Briggs, so the game's audience on PC and 360 hadn't had a God of War game available to them. The similarities could have been an excellent marketing draw. Marlow Briggs does differ a lot in tone too. Marlow is always in contact with King Tep, the titular Mask of Death. Steve Blum does a fantastic performance as a 2,000-year-old cannibal Mayan god, joking around with Marlow as the two quest to prevent maniacal businessman Heng Long from completing the process to ascend to godhood. There are also hints of another PlayStation exclusive franchise peppered throughout Marlow Briggs, but these are less noticeable. The controls are solid all around. Marlow's movements are satisfactory, and there is a means to express player skill during combat encounters. The camera is iffy throughout. It follows a designated path as the player progresses through the levels. Generally, this works well, and frees up the second stick to be used for dodging, but there are instances where the camera causes problems. Occasionally there will be a wide arena with corners that fall within the camera's blind spots, There are also places where I would have preferred the ability to choose what the camera's focus is on, like boss encounters or arenas with platforms within them. It also isn't possible to swap weapons during combos. The motion stops abruptly whenever Marlow pulls out a new weapon, which seems to be a missed opportunity to me. Combos with a single weapon are excellent though. The weapons all have chunky, heavy animations, with dense particle trails and zoom-ins on combo finishes. Marlow can grab enemies too, although grabs on humans aren't quite as fun as grabs on the beetle enemies. Humans can be tossed into each other or brainwashed to become an ally, which isn't as fun as it seems. The beetles get stomped in slow motion and it's awesome. Whenever a swarm appeared, I just started mashing the B button to watch Marlow stomp around the arena, squashing all of the bugs in his path. Larger enemies can be ridden and controlled too, with their own limited movesets. I dislike these, and they sometimes seem mandatory, but they do offer a break from Marlow's vast moveset. The game is crammed with different enemy types. There are 3 distinct factions within the enemies: Long's human forces, the insect creatures from the jungle, and zombified Mayan people. The 3 will occasionally fight each other when Marlow is too far away, which is a great touch. Long's men have a wide variety of enemy types for the player to battle. These include the standard goons, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, riot shields, professionals, and berserkers. The regular goons aren't very dangerous, but they make good bodies to beat up and play with all of the combos. They often appear in large groups, so there's regular opportunities to do something cool to them. Rocket launcher goons have a rare ranged attack. They stay at the edge of the battle and run away if Marlow gets too close. The player has to time a block when the rocket is close and send it back at the goon. This is a unique solution to defeating this enemy, and it's a good idea to add simple variety to the enemy pool. Flamethrowers will occasionally stand in place and blast a wall of flames around themselves. This deals a big chunk of damage and should push the player away. These enemies will also run into attack directly, which means they can become hidden in a crowd, so keeping an eye on them is part of the challenge. The shield bearers are another interesting puzzle enemy. They have a decent armor value that prevents them from being staggered while they have the shield. Certain combos or exceeding the armor value causes the shield to shatter, and they become a regular goon. With the shield, they will do a charging attack that moves much faster than it seems. There are also a few instances where a large group of these guys show up, and the ensuing chaos is ridiculous. Professionals are regular goons with larger health pools and a more complex moveset, as well as the ability to block some attacks. These are relatively rare enemies, and unfortunately don't stick out too well if there are other enemies around. Battling the groups that contain professionals as though they weren't there is also the most effective way to deal with them. The berserker is even rarer than the professional, and make a hilarious noise when hit. They're fast and deal a lot of damage with their combos, and they can't be lifted in the air to juggle. This rarity is likely why I like them so much, but I'd prefer to like them than not. Insect enemies have fewer varieties, but they stand out against the humanoid types. The standard beetle enemies are always plentiful and make good chaff for the other 3 insect enemies. They aren't dangerous, but there are always so many that the player has to be wary of them. They get stomped and it's great. There are wasp enemies that fly above swing height and fire projectiles. They'll occasionally come down to the ground, where they're easily dealt with. They also die from being grabbed, which seems to be missing an animation, but they aren't easy to get a hold of. There are some wasp nests that infinitely spawn wasps while blocking forward progress. These can be destroyed, but the player will have to contend with the wasps it spawns. There are living bomb bugs that I honestly barely remember, because they're used so infrequently. They do a lot of damage upon exploding, but the radius is so small that they aren't really dangerous. The final insect enemy is the giant scorpion. These enemies have a lot of different attacks initially, and can deal a lot of damage if not correctly respected. Damage to the front end of the scorpion can cut its claw off, which reduces the scorpion's offensive capability. Marlow can take control of this enemy after it takes enough damage, which gives Marlow a shield, but also massively reduces his attack options. Mayan enemies don't appear until late in the game, and their complicated designs are certainly late game enemy styled. The Mayan grunt enemies are wraith-like creatures that regularly retreat into the floor. They have charging attacks as well as a simple slash, and are quite a challenge to deal with. The most effective strategy I found was to use the chain knife and swing wide, as the fixed camera often makes detecting the wraiths before they attack difficult. The priest enemy can summon the wraiths, so including the priest within Marlow's damage radius is a good idea. The priest also fires a painful damage spell that moves slowly enough to be dodged. He doesn't move, however, instead teleporting away when in too much danger. The princess enemy is sparsely used as well, but offers a strong challenge when she does appear. When Marlow is far away, the princess will throw projectiles that stagger Marlow if unblocked. In melee range, she can dodge or use one of her combos that hurt a lot. Two of these enemies appear at the same time very late into the game, and the way their moves can layer over each other leads to certain death. The Juggernaut is the last enemy type and is another controllable foe. He has a large mace but moves very slowly. His attacks are so obvious that it'd be uncommon to ever be hit. When Marlow is controlling the Juggernaut, the attacks take an absurdly long time to come out, and it is kind of boring to play as. Marlow Briggs is presented in a B-movie fashion, starring amateur actors and a tiny number of extras. While the human models look okay, they're expressionless during cutscenes, which is very noticeable. And while there are so many different enemy types, the number of different models is quite low. The environments are superb though. The scale is gigantic, and there are always new things to see. The total number of environments isn't huge, but it is sensible to have a focus on rainforest, ancient temples, and silly, humongous machines. I do adore some of these environments. They're so insanely huge. There are some rough edges here and there, but nothing to be upset about. The more fantastical models are surprisingly homogeneous. I had expected things like the large scorpion or some of the bosses to seem strange within the art style, but they never go beyond appropriately goofy. The handful of boss encounters is an odd collection of mechanics that teeter on the verge of meeting the criteria to be a boss. Enemies like Zipakna and Chieftain Hammerhead are certainly more traditional bosses, but then there's the crane encounter or the water beast that seem like bosses, but they could also just be level hazards. For simplicity, I'll divide the encounters by whether I think they were created for the spectacle or to be a boss. The crane, the avatar of Chak, and the hurricane are our first category. There are many different diversions from the combat and platforming gameplay that show up periodically throughout the game. My personal favourite was the shoot 'em up sections, but there were sliding sections and turret sections too. Marlow makes his way deep into an enormous ore processing machine and finds a rail cart with a turret mounted onto it. The crane in this room is pivotal to Long's plan, so destroying it is something Marlow has decided he must do. The cart follows a track around the crane while it periodically exposes large pistons that the player must shoot with the turret. This place is so huge that helicopters will appear to defend the crane. The shooting mechanics are decent. They didn't have to be amazing, and they aren't, but I don't fault them. The concept is just less interesting than the rest of the game. The turret had been used by this point, and shooting pistons isn't an exciting thing to do. The avatar of Chak is the massive water monster that had been captured by Long's forces. They were aware that the avatar is somehow connected to the rituals necessary for Long to ascend, but they haven't figured out exactly what they need to do. When Marlow arrives here, Tep comments that the target is beyond the avatar's eye. At the beginning of this encounter, Marlow battles goons on a conveyor belt in front of the avatar. Once Marlow makes his way to the end of the conveyor, the avatar smacks Marlow back to the start. Now, Marlow must proceed back down the conveyor while the avatar slams its tentacles onto the belt. It's odd to do this section twice in a row, and it isn't especially exciting. After making it to the end of the conveyor again, the avatar takes another swing at Marlow. This time, Marlow grabs onto the tentacle and begins climbing along it. There are spines that snap closed to prevent the player from going backwards. There are also worm parasites buried in the tentacle that die in a single hit, so the climb isn't dangerous at all. At the top, it transitions into a quick time event where the prompts are difficult to notice. Used sparingly, I don't mind QTEs, but they can be easily overdone. Marlow uses the scythe to pop the avatar's eye out of its head, but doesn't manage to reach the item within before the creature collapses and falls down a deep cavern. The player makes their way out of the facility to see a large lake. The body of the avatar has surfaced in the lake, near a platform where a group of grunts are looking over at it. The player clears the platform and goes to finish the avatar off. It isn't dead though, and it awakens to lift the platform up to continue the fight with Marlow. This part of the encounter is much more like a traditional boss fight. The avatar uses its tentacles to hold up the platform while it slaps at Marlow. The player must attack the grasping tentacles until the avatar's face becomes vulnerable. This whole encounter is strange. I don't dislike it, but it's kind of bland, and not nearly as epic as I expected it to be. A giant monster battle is an excellent opportunity for spectacular visuals, and it's disappointing that this encounter doesn't meet the awesomeness of the rest of the game. Huracan is a badass sky serpent that lays hidden in an ancient underground Mayan temple. Huracan emerges from the tunnels and corners Marlow on a small isolated platform with a single hang point above it. The player must watch Huracan for tells and dodge appropriately, then counterattack provided Huracan gives the player the opportunity. During this phase, Huracan will either bite or use a breath attack. Bites must be dodged by repositioning or rolling, and since Huracan has no limbs, it'll leave its head low to be hit. The breath attack causes the entire platform to be covered in damaging winds, which the player must use the hang point to avoid. This is a neat use of the level's mechanics, with an enemy that looks intimidating and acts in an understandable way. Huracan also gets bloodied as the fight goes on, and eventually Marlow tosses the serpent across the cavern onto a previous part of the level. There, Marlow and Huracan continue the battle beneath a slamming fireball trap. Huracan switches to a chin slam move and a new breath attack. The player's objective here is to drive the serpent backward until its head is crushed by the fireball. The best encounter so far, despite its dissimilarity to the rest of the game. Zipacna, Chieftain Hammerhead, the Chibalba Hellbeast, and Long's ascended form are the more standard encounters of the bosses. Instead of being a machine cycling through scripted attacks, these enemies are much more like the other enemies within the game. They patrol around the arena and use more varied attacks in pursuit of the player. I personally prefer this style of encounter, as the fights are much more dynamic and frantic. Zipacna is a hulking, zombified, meaty mech suit. The model is fantastic, and its attacks are appropriately flaily. It is possible to control this enemy, like the giant scorpion, and use its devastating attacks against the Zipacna's allies. The first encounter with Zipacna ends with 4 priests spawning, which immediately kill the beast, so the player doesn't get much opportunity to use these big attacks. The earth-shattering slam would have been great to mash a bunch of bugs, but the opportunity just doesn't present itself. Chieftain Hammerhead is an upgraded juggernaut with a bigger weapon and golden armor. He has a different moveset that makes the encounter unique, but his introduction is the best part. Marlow approaches the arena while the chieftain is just finishing off a group of empowered giant scorpions. If the chieftain lands a hit, Marlow gets launched across the arena, so the player had better be careful. The Chibalba Hellbeast appears very late into the game, and is by far the weakest of the more standard boss fights. The Hellbeast is a large dog creature that uses 2 elemental attacks and can't be staggered. It doesn't make for a great punching bag because it hardly reacts to being hit, and so long as Marlow isn't in front of it, the Hellbeast doesn't really attack. Kind of disappointing, but Long makes up for it. Eva had been intentionally mistranslating pieces of the rituals, so despite Long still becoming a powerful demigod, his transformation is not as catastrophic as it could have been. Long's attacks are impressively varied, with a mix of ranged magic and enormous flaming sword attacks. Within the first phase of the fight, Long will occasionally leap into the air and shoot a string of fireballs at Marlow, which must be rolled away from. When landing, Long slams the ground and creates a gigantic earth elemental spell effect. The player must jump and use the gliding power to avoid taking damage here. Long can also cause a lightning storm to strike some random locations within the arena. His sword attacks can come in a few different swings, but the big slam provides the best window to attack. After a transition, Long's second phase removes all of the ranged attacks and only uses the sword. This is because Marlow's weapon has been tossed aside, so Marlow has to box Long in order to defeat him. This is a great final battle. It's epic and dramatic, and is appropriately difficult. It could have been so easy to make a QTE final boss, and because it isn't, I already think better of it. Long is a good conclusion to the game, and his defeat wraps the story up nicely.
Long, your only destiny was to wish we never met.
It is as the prophecy foretold. The sacred warrior triumphs. The land of my people is saved.
The narrative is weak, but silly enough to be enjoyable. The entire cast of 5 is introduced within the first 5 minutes, which includes Marlow's death and resurrection. The events are barely above a Mario story, but I'll recap them. Marlow Briggs, a smoke jumper from California, has taken a holiday to visit his archaeologist girlfriend Eva while she's working on site translating Mayan texts. Eva decides to introduce Marlow to her boss before continuing the tour through the site, and the pair wander toward a large tent. Inside, Heng Long asks Eva about her progress. Eva confirms that her work is progressing well, but the destruction to the site is too severe for her to continue. Long refuses to let Eva go. Marlow encourages Eva to leave immediately, and the two are seized by Long's guards. To demonstrate that Eva has no options but to obey, Long has Kim Carreras use a relic scythe to kill Marlow. Eva is taken away, and all of Long's forces leave while Marlow is still impaled on the ground. King Tep, the Mask of Death, appears and lays upon Marlow's face. This resurrects Marlow and empowers him as the chosen warrior. Back from the dead, Marlow's quest is to rescue Eva and prevent Long from completing enough rituals to become a god. Along the way, Kim attempts to secure a powerful artifact from being taken by Marlow, but she is ultimately cornered. She chooses to betray Long and work with Marlow, which later results in her death. Meanwhile, Eva intentionally feeds Long mistranslations to slow him down and minimize the potency of the rituals. That's it, really. The introduction kind of blazes by, and the other events happen in the background while Marlow rampages through the jungle. It's fine, but I really dislike Eva's notes. They're too tell don't showy, which could have been done through the PA system much better. The PA taunts are an excellent example of the game's charm. Long and the female voice add some funny lines in between the chaos of battle. I personally really enjoy when characters make in-universe jokes to each other and they laugh. It's an effective display of their friendship, and fantastic development when the characters weren't friends at the start of the story. King Tep generally has a lot of amusing anecdotes to throw in that are his entire character development, but they're charming and entertaining enough to be special. Marlow is a good straight man, so when Tep says something absurd, it doesn't just pass by. Marlow won't allow Tep to whimsically reminisce about the first human heart he ate, and rightfully so. The two are a well-written duo. Long's characterization is also magnificent. There are portraits of him throughout his facilities, and he's very willing to toss the infinite goons in his forces at Marlow, because there are infinite numbers of them. There is some awkwardness, though. Between the implied chapters, there are weird 1 frame per second animations that signify some kind of transition. Initially I liked these because I thought they represented Marlow being overtaken by the chosen warrior's instincts and not actively making the actions being shown. Marlow's expressionless face during these sequences is pretty bad. They don't look like any care was put into them as a result. The opening pre-rendered animation also has some poor shadow baking that can't be fixed within the options menu. How this problem made it into the animation indicates a polish issue that should be present throughout the rest of the game, but there really isn't. They just dropped the ball here, and I don't really understand why it wasn't fixed. There's a turret section where the turret is being towed down a road filled with hazards that would have been excellent if there were enemies on the ground. Instead, there are only helicopters that aren't really concerned about the hazards. Oops. But other than a really unfortunate texture seam, that's it. The game's length is perfect. There are so many options in combat. There are a bunch of different gameplay types, and they're all great. Unfortunately, Zootfly ceased development after Marlow Briggs, and the Slovenian video game industry receded away from PC and console development entirely. Different European nations have a wide variety of cultures that inform their art and perspectives, which always make for interesting video games, and Marlow Briggs embodies this, as well as being an enjoyable experience all around. Getting a hold of this game is a bit of an effort, but if you can, I absolutely implore you to play it.
Ah, Mr. Briggs. Too stubborn to die on your way here, I see. I don't think I've personally killed anyone in, 100 years.
Huh. Don't you worry. You won't be alive much longer. Eva!
Next time, we'll be exploring art while searching for our missing family.